So, what should you do now in 2022? Is it worth going out and buying a house, or should you say, hey, hold off? I'm going to wait. I'm going to see how the market kind of settles down, see if interest rates kind of reduce or even drop back to what they were a year ago. Drew, what do you think that our listeners should do in your eyes when it comes to going out in the housing market right now? Hello, we're Cavan and Drew with the Neighborhood Money Podcast, a video podcast about money and helping you build a life you deserve. Drew, how's it going today, my man? I'm excited for this episode.
It's going pretty good. On top of doing this episode that will get me excited, it's also has some sunshine outside today, so that also makes me very happy and
I,
in a good mood.
I'm in total dad mode. I got my lawnmower out finally. I got my grass cutting shoes ready. I've got my makeshift lawn striper that I just put together from just random stuff at Home Depot. And I am fully out there grinding, trying to have the best lawn in the neighborhood. Competition, no
Hey,
doubt.
if I can say anything with the lawn, today I was just out doing some raking with the baby and the baby Bjorn. So I had him on my chest like this, and I was raking the dead spots so I can finally get some good grass as as the summer goes on.
And then you also teach them young too to work hard and that the lawn is a place of paradise. At least for some people, I personally love it out there. But hey, we're not here to talk about lawn care. We're not even here to talk about being dads. We're here all today to talk about should you buy a house in 2022. So in today's episode, really excited. We're going to talk about the fundamentals of house buying, what the current state of the market is. I'm sure if you're in the market for looking for a house, you are well aware that the housing market and the housing prices continue to rise, even though rates continue to rise as well. And then lastly, we'll dive into, well, actually, should you buy a house in 2022, or should you wait and put it off and maybe the housing market will die down or interest rates might come down too? Who's to say? We'll dive all into that in this episode. But before I dive in, Drew, first, I want to say, hey, if you guys want to support this podcast, we ask you to please go out to Apple Podcasts and give this podcast a 5-star review and leave us a note. That helps us an awful lot. It helps show people that this podcast is worth listening to and that they can get value from it. Also, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel and liking this video. That also goes a long way to help the algorithms push this out to more and more people. All right, Drew, let's dive in. So the fundamentals of home buying, if you think about home buying, it gets into the emotional aspect of the individual. It's a very emotional time. It's stressful for a lot of people, but there's some things that you really need to consider specifically when you're looking at the 2022 home buying market. It's pretty crazy out there. So what are some of those fundamentals that we should be thinking about when looking to buy a home?
Fundamentals when buying a home, I think it comes back to first off what you can afford for a home and what you can afford per month. And these are coming in the form of most likely a mortgage for people. The To be able to save up for a home in today's market and actually pay cash for it is, I think, pretty rare and doesn't happen too often. So you're most likely going in the route of going for a mortgage. And when you're going in for a mortgage, there are things of potentially having to save up. So if you are looking for a home, there's going to be a down payment most likely that you have to put down. So some of the thoughts are what type of house you want, how big of a house you want, how much you can afford. And then with that is when you're saying, all right, how much do I have to save up to get this thing started? So I think the mortgage tends to be the first thing people hear about, and that's the main fundamental with buying a home. But along with buying a home, you also have a bunch of other things you don't think about during the year, such as like property taxes, repair and maintenance, maybe doing some stuff on your yard.
Yep, playing back. Hey, Drew, before we even go into the extra expenses, though, when you just think about the amount of house that you buy, I think that's a really important thing to dive a little further into, because a lot of people, when they go out to the banks to apply for a mortgage to see how much they can get out in house, they typically get that maxed out, and the banks will say, okay, you can take out to 500, 400, 300,000, whatever your credit limit allows, and then that's the house that they shop for. I think really need to hone in, well, how much house can I actually afford, not how much the bank tells me I can afford, because those things are totally different. You don't want to become house poor. You want to make sure that you've got extra room in your monthly budget on top of just paying for a mortgage. And so I think it's really important to make sure that when you're shopping for that house, that your mortgage payment or just your basic living expenses when it comes to shelter in your home is less than roughly around 30% of your take home pay.
That's a good point too when we're talking about what you can afford for a house. If you're going into buying a home, at least in my perspective of it, I wouldn't want to max out that limit that the bank can give me. There's always people that say you'll go house broke, and pretty much when they say you go house broke, it's almost all the money I get from my monthly income is going towards my house. So you don't really have the personal freedom or the freedom to go out to vacations or restaurants or buy gifts for maybe birthdays or any of those other entertainment side during the month. So that's kind of like a big thing is you don't want to be house broke because then you're going to be stuck in your house. You're going to get probably cabin fever,
Right.
cabin fever, not cabin. And
you
then
might get, you might get cabin fever after this podcast. We'll see.
definitely don't overextend yourself. It's something to think about. They give you a certain amount as a high limit, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's what the type of house that you want to look for.
I honestly think though that 25 to 30% of your take home pay for your living, so that's mortgage, insurance, and everything else, utilities that goes with it, keeping that in that 25 to 30% is kind of the sweet spot because it just allows you so much more room to do other things, right? So if you think about investing for retirement, and if you go with the 15 to 20, 25% there, then you have the 25 to 30% for your living. You still got a bunch of money left over for other things to enjoy outside of just saving for the future and paying for your house. So I think it's really important just to make sure that when you're looking at the size of house, have that number in mind before you even go looking, because I guarantee you that if your 25 to 30% of your take home pay is a $300,000 home, if you start shopping, you're going to want that 350, you're going to want that $400,000 home, and you probably can afford it, but it might make you a little tighter on a month to month basis. And that's something that we definitely want to avoid.
These are some other items when you are buying a house is do you want to be in a nicer neighborhood, better school district? And if so, you're going to have to plan on paying potentially higher property taxes or even that HOA. So that is also going to be baked into what you want to be putting towards your homes for that monthly take home income.
Drew, one thing that, and I just finished this book probably about a month ago. It's called The Everyday Millionaire. Um, and it was a study done in the 80s or the 90s. I can't remember quite off the top of my head, but it just looked at millionaires in the United States and how they became that. And interesting enough, most millionaires from that study lived in the neighborhoods that were not the nicer, newer neighborhoods. It was more of the working class neighborhoods. And so, and it also showed that people that lived in those higher end affluent neighborhoods typically had much less of net worth. And so I think that's a huge a myth, so to say, in society, is that people think that your value is tied to the size or the how nice your home is. That's really not the case. Actually, it's the opposite, that most people that do really well in the wealth building journey typically have a very modest home. They keep their mortgage as low as they can. They pay off their mortgage, and they really don't have that be a huge burden on their life. And it allows them to have more room in their income to save and invest for the future. And I think that was just a really interesting thing that I learned from reading that book that I wanted to bring out here today. But you started bringing it up a little bit earlier about how, not just your mortgage you need to consider, but taxes, and you need to consider maintenance. When you own a home, you have to fix the furnace, you have to fix the water softener when it breaks. You can't just call the landlord. And those are all additional costs that really never go into the equation when you are buying that house. So I think it's another thing to consider is, do you have extra room in your monthly budget to afford those types of things, whether it's to save up for a rainy day fund or to actually have, $200 to $300 per month set aside to actually cover those expenses.
As much as I hate, but also love to go back to yard work, uh,
Hey,
think
we're
about
all about yard work in this podcast, Drew. I'm all
yeah,
for it.
just it brings into mind, or it brings into mind for me when I got into the house here is you don't think about maybe that lawnmower or a snowblower or weed whacker or the gas that goes into the lawnmower, or you could have electric one, but those are little things that you really don't think about, or even furnishing your home. Do you need a couple beds for it? Do you need dressers? Do you need lamps? Do you need things to fill up your cabinets? So keep that in mind when you're first purchasing the home. It's, you probably most likely get into the home and slowly add on to those things when you can, but those are some things that tend to be one-time purchases but have to be baked in for your early on and as you move forward in that household.
One more thing that we need to consider too is how long are you actually going to live in that home? I like to think if you're not going to live in the home for 5 to 7 years, it might not make sense to actually buy the house. And here's why. One, it's very, very expensive to move. It's expensive to buy a house. You have to pay a ton of different fees, and it ranges between 3 to 7% of the actual cost of your house. Think of things like realtor fees, taxes, title transfer fees, a ton of other fees that I can't even think about right now. But you have to pay a ton in fees. You have to actually move, so you have to buy or rent a car, a truck, pay for gas depending on how far you're moving. And it's time consuming, right? And then it's also you don't know how that short term market's going to act. So you could get into a house tomorrow and sell in 2 years, and the market could tank on you. Whereas over the course of 5 to 7 years, there's a pretty good chance that it's going to be flat, or you might have a little appreciation in that asset over time and potentially break even when you count for all the different fees. So I kind of think of it as that 5 to 7 year time frame is a sweet spot of, hey, if I'm going to be there for that amount of time, maybe it makes sense to buy. But if not, I really need to look at the numbers and consider, if I'm going to move in the next 2 to 3 years, maybe it makes sense to just rent for the time being.
Yeah, in some of our previous episodes, we've touched on that before between renting and purchasing a home. And like you said, if you're going to be there probably 3 to 5 years or, anything less than that, maybe renting is the way to go just because you have the predictable income. You can get on top of your feet without worrying about any maintenance, anything breaking down, anything going wrong. And, something you might not think about living in an apartment is you can't really overflow unless you're going to be buying extra storage units. And so the amount of things you have to move to that potential next house of your dreams is going to be much less than if you have a house and you find a way to pack every nook and cranny of it. Because I can tell you right now, that happens at our house.
I think it happens at all houses, Drew.
Yeah, if you have, if you have, I think about people up north here. Everybody loves to have like a big garage,
Yeah.
and it's like they'll have like a 900 square foot or 500 square foot home, and their garage will be about twice the size of their home just because they love it so much. But it's like you can never get a big enough garage. Once you have a certain garage, you find a way to fill it, and then you wish you had a bigger one. And I think that's the kind of same way with homes, where whatever you have, it always kind of seems too small because you find ways to fill it up. And if you're stuck in an apartment, that way you are stuck in that confined space. You're not going to fill up too much. So if you do end up moving in that 3 to 5 years, then it's much easier to pack up because you're kind of already living out of a suitcase if you're just only going to be there for a couple of years anyways.
And really, honestly, Drew, there's really no rush to go out and buy a home. Sure, it might feel like it because the market might be hot. Houses might be on the market only for, 14, 15, or 14, 21 days, a couple of weeks. But at the end of the day, you've got time. There's going to be more houses out there. No, I can guarantee you this, Drew. No house is going to be perfect when you go out and buy it. It might seem perfect when you first buy it, but 6 months, 1 year, 2 years down the line, you're going to be like, oh man, I wish I had this. Oh man, I can't stand that. And so there's never going to
If,
be that
if
perfect
I
house.
if I can bring up one point there about not having the perfect house, from my own experience, it's quite funny. when I was living in apartment with my cousin, or when I was in college living in apartment with 8 other or 7 other people, and it was an absolute hole. But when I was living in it, it was completely fine.
Yeah,
But as I started walking through different homes, you find yourself nitpicking, like, oh, that's outdated. Oh, that's bad. Or this isn't good. And a couple of those small things will deter you from purchasing a good valued home just because you might be nitpicking. But I'm telling you right now, if you end up going with a better valued home like that, with those couple things you nitpicked for, you'll live in it and you won't even notice that those are an issue anymore because it's a functioning home with good bones.
exactly, exactly. So Drew, where are we at right now with the current market? You know, if we look back at some of the historical figures, the housing market's been extremely hot. I mean, just like everything else over the past 2 to 5 years, I will say, specifically the last two, with all of the massive influx of capital into the economy, as well as people having an excess amount of savings and rates being extremely low. So housing prices have soared over the last couple of years. But where does that bring us today?
Brings us in a weird spot, if you ask me. I don't know where these prices are going to be going. Just using some numbers here, it said like home prices rose, and this was as of April 2022. The home prices rose 15.6% year over year. The median price for a home is $424,000, and home sales were down actually 13.2% year over year. But it's just really strange that these prices keep going up and up and up, and it doesn't necessarily seem like the wages or in like the local areas are necessarily supporting that. So these prices, it's really strange because if you're looking for a home, like you want to be a homeowner, you have to jump on something extremely fast, and you tend to pay over the asking price for it. So if you're not rushing to get into a home, I don't even know if I'd necessarily get in a home. But then I also think if you get into a home now and the prices keep rising, then you're going to be saying, why didn't I just get in 5 years ago to this home? So these prices that go up, they keep going up. There's a bunch of homes that are getting purchased over market price. Now rates are going up, but wages aren't going up as much. To me, it's just a very strange area to be in the housing market.
To try to give some context to, you know, the almost 16% year over year home price increase, on average home prices should rise about 3% per year. They should be roughly in line with inflation, maybe a little bit more. But we've seen, like you said, Drew, just a massive increase in home prices, and with that comes people putting offers that are 30, 40, 50,000. You know, I had an old neighbor who put down, I think, or offered like 30 grand over asking, and was outbid by someone that put down 90 grand over asking. It's just, it's
And it'll be
wild.
like a cash offer or something.
Yeah, exactly. So it's pretty wild out there. But I think, you know, if we want to bring it in just a little bit, like what does that even mean if you actually are shopping for a home? I think one, don't let your emotions get the best of you, right? You might have to offer higher than um asking, and maybe that's okay because that's what the market's driving. But make sure that you have things like an inspection. Make sure you take all those necessary steps, that more than likely a realtor will tell you, hey, maybe you don't want to do this because it makes your offer uh less strong. But I can guarantee you that an inspection is going to save you a ton of money in the long run. Just as an example there, I think it was about a year ago, and I know that's a little dated now, but I had a coworker that was looking for a house and put an offer down, had the inspection, and found out that their water sewage was completely messed up, and it was going to be a $25,000 fix by the homeowner. It wasn't a city problem. And they were able to back out from the offer because of that inspection. So, you know, the inspection costs $200 to $500 to get, but it can save you thousands of dollars on the line. So even in these crazy markets, you still need to go back to those fundamentals of when you actually put that offer in, and make sure that you're catching all your bases so that you don't put yourself in a situation that's going to cost you more money down the line.
And in this current market, if you are going to be overpaying for a home, make sure you have that number set in your mind, because if you get into some type of bidding war, your emotions will get into it. I mean, that's just the facts. And if you go over what you can actually afford just to get that house, it may put you in a pretty tough financial position. So you kind of want to be able to go in with a plan saying how much is my top, even if I'm going to be asking over. And I need to make sure I get an inspection. I need to make sure I do X, Y, and Z. And if those can't be met when you're going in for an offer for the home, it might not be the home for you. It might not be meant to be, because you want to be coming out of there with a as best deal as you can get. And if somebody else is going to get a completely horrible deal and they end up finding out that they have to put 40 grand into the home just to bring it up to code or something like that, then you're going to be saving yourself a lot of heartache and money.
And to be honest, Drew, like I think you were kind of saying is, I don't really see the end in sight here. There, with rates rising right now, that in theory should push home prices down, and we're not actually seeing that right now. You can continue to see prices rise, and really, that's all attributed to the fact that in the United States here, and really when you drill down to like the regional areas, some places are worse than others, but there is such a shortage of housing available and just a massive influx of people that are moving from apartments to wanting now to buy a house, that even with rates rising there, it's just so competitive out there that in order to get a house, yeah, you're going to have to pay a premium for that. And if that's something that's going to fit in your long-term vision, I love looking at the long term. If you've listened to this podcast for more than 5 minutes, you know that I'm a long-term thinker. But thinking long term and how the purchase of that house, regardless of the price, fits into that. It's the most important thing when buying a house. And regardless of the market, regardless is a hot or cold market, you always need to consider the fact that, hey, how is this going to impact my long term goals?
I know you're talking on supply there a little bit. If there's one other figure I can put into perspective that I end up finding with these home prices. So this Florida Atlantic University did a big study on the housing market, and they wanted to see like which homes are overpriced in what regions, and they end up finding it was 65% of the housing markets are overpriced. And then they went and checked out the 100 top housing markets, and they found out 100% of them were overpriced. And they're trying to say that, I'm trying to look here, uh 44% are overpriced by at least 30%. So these top 100 housing markets, not only are they overpriced, but they're overpriced by 30%. And that to me is so crazy. Uh I can't even like fathom it, and people keep buying homes.
Regardless, even if it is overpriced, right? They're still selling for that. So that's still something you need to consider. Like if you want to buy a house, you're going to have to pay that premium. And it's just kind of unfortunate. But Drew, let's dive into a little bit more about rates, because I think interest rates is something that normally when people buy a house look at, they say, okay, if I can get a low interest rate, that's good. That means I can afford it. Well, we've kind of demyth that, if that's even a word, earlier around, hey, you actually need to look at your monthly budget and how that fits into your monthly budget. Try to keep it into that 25 to 30% of your take home pay. Make sure it meets your long term goals.
And
But
that's not just the mortgage, it's all the housing expenses.
absolutely. But your interest rate still matters a heck of a lot. And I know a lot of people go to one bank or one credit union or one mortgage company and they get quoted, and that's the rate they use. Well, I think specifically now that rates are high, I think, Drew, you've got figures here to share in a little bit, but now that rates are high and they're rising, it's more important now than ever to shop around and to get two, three, four different quotes for interest rates.
Yeah, the interest rates as of that April 2020 were at about 5% for a 30-year fixed. And then as of May 12th, they are at 5.3% for a 30-year fix. So you can see that these rates are continuing to grow at really no signs of slowing down. I know the Fed's can been talking about even more hike rates as the year goes on. So these rates are going to continue to go up, and if you didn't end up refinancing during this last year, I know we've had an episode in the past where maybe if you were able to refinance to get 1 or 2% better rates, then it might have been worth it. But as of right now, I'm guessing your rates, if you're already in a house, are probably similar to what they are now, and maybe refinancing might not be the best situation, but definitely something to look into. But just also a perspective to look on what these rates can do is if you had a $350,000 house that you're going into, and you when at the current rates of 5.3%, it'd be a mortgage rate of roughly $1,900. And if you got into a home couple months ago or a year ago and is around 3%, it would be around $1,400 for your mortgage payment. So a difference in roughly 2% of your mortgage rate is $500 for your monthly payment. And as you've heard in the past, if you had an extra $500, one of the best places you can put that would be maybe that Roth IRA, where you're saying, where can I get that extra $500? It might be from a 2% difference in your mortgage rate from a potential refinance.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it just from a number standpoint, 3% to 5% doesn't sound like a lot in really any other context. But in this context, wow, like $500 extra a month fully funds a Roth IRA. If you fully,
That's 6 grand a year, right?
yep. So if you fully fund your Roth IRA over the course of 40 years, your average working time, you're going to be a millionaire, if not above the $1 million mark, right? And so that's a ton of money. So that opportunity cost of having a higher mortgage means that you have less money to invest. And I think opportunity cost is a big thing here. But Drew, let's talk a little bit about just like how interest rates kind of operate for some of our listeners that may not be as familiar with it. So we've talked in the past, and you've probably have heard about inflation, right? And a way for the Fed to kind of curb inflation is to raise the Fed's funds rate, which basically just has the flat level that banks can loan to each other or from the government. And right now, I don't even remember the Fed funds rate is at, but it's set at a level, and then banks will look at that rate, and let's just say it's 3%, the Fed's funds rate set by the Federal Reserve. They'll look at that and they'll say, okay, well, based on this person that's applying for a mortgage, taking into account their credit score, we're going to add on top of that a 2% premium because of their risk level. You might be 2% if you're a little bit more risky. It might be 3, 4%. If you're less risky, it might be 1%, give or take. But then you add those together, and that's what ultimately your mortgage rate is. And so as inflation continues to soar and as the Federal Reserve keeps hiking interest rates, that's only going to lead to higher mortgage rates to kind of try to say, hey, let's cool the jets on the economy. Let's sell less houses to try to bring down inflation. So that's a little bit background around the interest rates and how they kind of operate. And with the really hot economy right now, I think, Drew, if you remember what the inflation report was for this last month, it was like around 7.5, 8% again. And so we're not really seeing a slowdown in inflation, meaning that the Fed is probably going to have to hike rates again, which is going to thus in turn hike mortgage rates in the next couple of months. And that's probably going to happen a couple more times. And so interest rates most likely are going to rise. Again, we can't predict the future, but just from basic economics, that's kind of the direction that it looks like it's going. So interest rates are going to rise, meaning that if you're looking to get into a house, if you wait a couple more months, you actually might have a higher interest rate than you might get today.
Opportunity costs of potentially buying a home now compared in the future and where these rates are going is definitely something that you do have to take into consideration. But I really wouldn't force myself into a house that wasn't the right fit just for an interest rate. I guess there are things with the home of wanting to be in a location you want to be in a house that you're comfortable to be in. buying a home on your own terms and your own plan for your budget and for the things that need to be done for you to get into that house. But the rates are a reality, and it's something that we have to put into our okay, or put into our equation and our plan for looking at this next house if it is the right option for us.
So, what should you do now in 2022? Is it worth going out and buying a house, or should you say, hey, hold off? I'm going to wait. I'm going to see how the market kind of settles down, see if interest rates kind of reduce or even drop back to what they were a year ago. Drew, what do you think that our listeners should do in your eyes when it comes to going out in the housing market right now?
Well, this is kind of the other side of the coin. If you are currently in a house right now, I want you to remember, like, even though the prices are high, if you get more money for your house than you were expecting, just remember that everybody else's house price is high. So you might be selling high just to go into something else with a high price too. So that's one thing to consider. As far as maybe your first time home buyer or somebody looking to relocate in a home, it's really up to what you want out of a house, or if maybe seeing if renting may be a better option, because you have to think if you want to be in a certain place for short term compared to long term. But ultimately, I think a theme that comes through this podcast is really making a plan and writing down what it is that you want out of a house. Because if you're just getting into a house to get into a house, it may affect your future with investing or your future with your monthly activities and so on. So, those are just some of my kind of thoughts. It's not very detailed, but it really does come down to what you want out of a house. But we're here to give you some of the facts and the figures to help point you in the right directions and think about things that you might not have thought about during your current planning.
I think you really need to drill down into your 5 to 7, even 10-year plan when you're thinking about buying a house, and try to take a step away from the actual current market that we're in. Because I think if you go into the market and you deal with your emotions, and trust me, when you go out and buy a house, it's going to be emotional. I've done it now twice, and I can tell you, you have a plan going into it. And as soon as you start visiting houses, you step into them, you start getting all these different thoughts of, well, maybe we can stretch here, maybe we can do that and whatnot. But, always make sure that you keep that level headed mind. So having, like Drew said, having that game plan ahead of time, writing down things that you want, making sure that you know what your max dollar amount is for a home, and shopping below that so you can potentially, when you are offering, you know, still stay under whatever that max amount is. And so I think that's generally what's really important is make sure that you don't rush into a decision because you think the market's hot or you think the interest rates are going to rise. Who knows what's actually going to happen? Drew and I have shared some of our thoughts here today, but we have no idea either what is going to transpire in the near to midterm future. And I think it's just important to make sure that you have that plan, go in level headed, have that long term vision, and as well as just have a holistic view on your finances. Make sure that you continue to save for your future and invest for your future, and not just be strapped down by a house that you rushed into and are going to potentially look back and say, hey, maybe that wasn't the best financial decision 1, 2, 3 years down the line, and either move, or even if you refinance because rates are lower, then that's still going to be cost you money, and it's going to extend your loan more than likely. So those are all just things to consider. But to answer the question of should you buy a house in 2022, I think it's really just dependent, right, of the situation that you're in. If you're ready to buy a house, if you've looked at all of this, if you've had these conversations with your partner or with someone that you trust, if you're single, sure, go out and shop. Make sure that you keep that level headedness. And 2022 could be a great time to buy, or it could be a really bad time depending on where you're at in your current state.
I guess my really, if I could speak to anybody, any part of the group, if I could speak to like the people that don't necessarily need a house, I think those are like where my thoughts can come through as, like, I guess maybe it's more controversial to like what's out there, but because I'm not necessarily in a position where I'm looking for a home, and I'm fortunate where I'm in, fortunate enough where I am in a home. But if I was in somebody like in my position, I really think there's going to be a market correction. Not, I mean, there's one happening in the stock market, but I think there will be one in the housing. Everything I read tends to be the market's going to continue to go up. It tends to be from a lot of real estate type
The
of
mortgage
companies.
companies.
And as I've looked back on stuff in like 2008, just from videos, it was like anything in like the big media and everything in the big articles. The sentiment then was always, no way the market's going to crash. It's hot. It's going to be hot. And I'm starting to kind of feel that again right now. And if you're in a position where you don't necessarily need a home, I don't know if I would purchase a home in here because I think everything is completely overpriced right now. The rates are historically like pretty cheap, so it doesn't really, I wouldn't really worry about if it goes up even like another 2 percentage points, even though you can see that it maybe saves you $500 or so a month or more. But really, I think when I was talking to my dad back in like the 80s, the interest rates were almost like 15-20%. So put it in perspective, they're actually kind of cheap right now. But I just think I would hold off on a home if you don't need one. That's my thought. I think there's going to be some type of correction coming in here. I think there has to be. I don't know how a home can be valued at what they're valued at right now. And the only sad thing is if people stop buying homes, I think institutions are going to continue to buy them and have them out as rental units, and they're going to push the price up even further. So until there's some type of correction where it maybe unfortunately hurts institutions or some other people, I don't think maybe purchasing a home right now is a great idea. My little rant, 2 cents.
Or maybe five. We'll see. But no, I think
Yeah,
you're right to an extent. I mean, you hear, well, I suppose you hear this all the time, but you hear recessionary talks. We've seen that the market has gone down. You've seen that Bitcoin and the cryptocurrency markets have dropped even further. So there's been this, because of the Fed raising rates, because of just the trajectory of the market in
we have
general.
print money being printed,
Exactly.
inflation's up,
Exactly,
rates are
exactly.
going up.
And so, I mean, if you think about how that plays out, if the Fed overcorrects and raises rates too fast, that puts us into a recession, which in theory has dropped home prices. Granted, who really knows how it's going to operate? And so that's kind of where I fall back into, hey, you don't know the future. If you're ready to buy that house, go buy that house. If you like, I totally agree with you, Drew. If you can hold off, and maybe you can get a little luckier in the next 6 to 12 months and find a house that you want for cheaper or rates down. Who's to say? But it at least doesn't make you jump into the decision and go into it with emotions ran high because you're worried that you need to get into this house because there's no other options available.
If I can add any more statistics on here, because I know we're numbers guys, it's finance or personal finance type of podcast, but this number on here, I'm just going to read it. It was there's estimates to show the average American households would have to spend 30%, 32% of their monthly income to make mortgage payments at these prices, these historically high prices. This is according to Black Knight, which is a mortgage data provider. This is the highest it's been since 2006. And they put that into perspective and they said back in like the 2010s, it was spending about 19% of that monthly income on your mortgage payment. So I know in the beginning of this, it might sound confusing when we say anywhere from that, 20, 25, 30% of your house monthly income for your household. We're thinking like all expenses and everything put together in it. This of the 32% is just your mortgage payment. So you're looking at maybe spending close to 40, 45% of your monthly income on your house.
Which is crazy. That, I mean, that just doesn't leave any room for other things like investing. At least not probably enough investing to meet your long-term goals. But Drew, so that was a lot around the 2022 market. If you're looking to buy a house right now, it's a really tough environment. But if you're ready, I think between the two of us, we can kind of generally agree. Like, if you are ready to go and buy a house, if you've thought about all these things we've talked about in this podcast, if you are sure that the amount of house you're buying is not going to deter any of your long-term goals, it's a great time to go out and buy a house. Anytime's a great time to go out and buy a house. But if you're not ready, if you haven't had these conversations, or if you can hold off, maybe it's a really good time to hold off and just see how things play out.
Make sure to write down that plan, have that certain price you're going to do, what you're going to pay over, and the things you need to be done, like a house inspection, and maybe they have to actually fix some stuff. Make sure that's in your plan when you're going into this, because you want to come out this as the best deal possible you can get as well.
Well, if you can't tell, well, first of all, I should say, if you're watching the video and if you can't tell by my red face and peely nose, I am officially back from Florida. Our family just went out for about 5 days, soaked up the sun, and it was a blast. But Drew, maybe I'll talk about that a little more in a bit, but what's going on over in your neck of the woods? What's going on in your neighborhood this week?
Well, nothing necessarily this last week, but this weekend coming up, we are going to head to the lake, and this will be the first time being up at the lake
Nice lake
since
season,
last year.
baby.
Yeah, so we are excited about that. We found out like the water is extremely high for the lakes around here at the moment. My parents' lake property, they have one of their docks that stays in over the winter, and right now the water is over the dock. So if you're trying to go out to the boat, you're literally like Jesus because you're walking on water. It's a crazy swing too, because last year it was almost like record lows. So on that same dock, I could sit on the dock, have my feet hanging over, and there were still probably 6 inches before I was even hitting the water. So for that to go from that at the end of last fall, pretty much till this spring, and now it's over the dock. My parents have like another dock that they put down and up during the winter, so they brought it down, and they weren't able to really put the dock slices on it or whatever you call those because they would be floating away and the water'd be over that. So we're waiting for the water to drop down a little bit more to put the rest of the dock together. So that's some of the stuff I get going on coming up. I'm pretty excited to go up to the lake because I really enjoy just being kind of in the wilderness, being on the lake for sure. Hopefully it's a nice weather and maybe I can sneak out and get some fishing in, because it was fishing opener this past weekend in Minnesota and I wasn't able to make it out.
Man, I got to tell you, man, I am so pumped for it to be warm weather and nice here in Minnesota after this winter, how cold it was and how long it ended up being. I think like 3 weeks ago, you guys probably still had snow up north, whereas we were still probably in like the 40s and 50s down here in the metro area. But man, just have like 70s and 80s and trying to get outside again and just enjoy not being cooped up in the house. I couldn't be more happier for it to be this time of year.
Well, your trip to Florida probably worked out nice because your body's getting used to the warm weather. You have a little bit of Irish blood in you, so you have to get a head start on the summer weather as much as you can, because I'm right there with you. I actually don't have that much Irish in me,
Oh
but
yeah.
as you can see, it's like comes through hard in my hair and my beard.
You
But
look like
uh,
you look almost identical to a leprechaun. You just orange red hair, orange beard.
I don't know why Notre Dame didn't just like call me up and want me to be their mascot. It would have been perfect. I could be on the football field or like basketball court, and then I could just be a leprechaun.
I think that's your next calling. If I'm going to be totally honest with you, if this podcast thing kind of fizzles out, I think being a leprechaun for Notre Dame might be your next best bet.
And if that doesn't happen, we'll just host a Halloween party either at your house this year or up north, and then that will be my Halloween
There you
costume.
go.
And our my mine and my wife's baby. I didn't want to say our baby because then maybe thought people think it'd be mine and yours baby. But he's starting to get a little bit of red hair too, so I don't know where. It's kind of strawberry blonde right now. So if I become the Notre Dame leprechaun, he could follow suit.
So I do have some Irish blood in me. I'm about a quarter though, but I have Bohemian blood in me as well, which is like the opposite end of like the
Oh.
fairness of skin. And so I burn really easy on the first sun of the year, and then I get super tan the rest of the year. So right now I'm battling on my face and on my back, just being burnt. But I know that if I power through this, I'm gonna be set for the summertime to have just a nice burn free summer. So
So I have a question for you. Going back to Florida, how did the kids like the sand and the beach for the first time?
I feel like it's almost like every kid. They just love playing in the sand, a little scared of the ocean, got a little more accustomed to the ocean, but still a little too scared to go out a a decent ways. Honestly, it's probably more so mom and dad are scared because our son is almost 3. So it's the ocean can take them in a snap of a finger, but they both loved it. Sand was everywhere in their eyes, in their ears, in their nose, toes. But man, it was so much fun. It's kind of ironic because we have been having such cold weather here in Minnesota, and the week that we went to Florida was the first week that hit the 80s here in the Twin Cities. So we basically had the same weather in Minnesota that we had down in Florida, but we had the ocean and we had a pool, so I wouldn't trade it, and it was just absolute blast. Happy to be back, but had a good time down there.
It's funny that you brought up that all kids love the beach and the sand. And I have one nephew that went complete opposite of that when we were when we were in Florida. He wanted to go to the beach, wanted to go to the beach, wanted to play in the sand, and he got there, went into the ocean, and hated the salt water. And then he came out of the water, and then of course when your body's wet, sand sticks to you and it gets everywhere. So then he tried wiping sand off with his hand, which then had sand, and then he didn't know what to do, so then he tried wiping off with his other hand, which had sand, and then he just started screaming, being like, I hate this sand. Get this sand off me. Get this sand off me. So then we had to my mom. So it would have been my nephew's grandmother grabbed him and brought him to like a shower, rinsed it off, and then had to carry him back out onto the beach. And then we had like a big towel that he could go on, and he would not touch the sand the rest of the
He
time.
is just forever going to be afraid of sand.
Yeah, just screaming. It's like he wanted to eat something, so then he'd try eating it, but it'd be sandy and grainy, and he just was like so pissed off that he just like, get me out of the
I
sand.
got to be totally honest. Our kids did not have a care in the world when they were eating with their sandy fingers. They just shoveled it all and sand it all. And our 1 year old just like ate sand by the handfuls. We tried to limit her and like say, hey, no, no, no. But what can you do at the end of the day? But no, man, it was so much fun being down there. And I'm a big beach person. The beach is my wife's favorite place in the world. So man, it couldn't have been a better trip.
I'm glad that you had a great trip and you had some water in your neighborhood, and it looks like we're gonna have some water in this neighborhood going forward. There's a lot going on in the housing market. If you are in the market for purchasing a house, I'm hoping that this episode brought to light some of the facts and the figures that are going on in this market, and also bringing up some things to think about when you're first purchasing that first home. Ultimately, this decision really comes up to what you want, and if you are in the market for buying a home, make sure you have that plan put together. If you are in the market of being able to sit back and not actually have to purchase a home, I think it might be a great time to have caution, sit back, and see what the market really can do. With all that said, we appreciate you guys listening to the latest episode of the Neighborhood Money Podcast, and we will see you next week in the neighborhood.